Bit of a lag again. Let's just see if... Alright, it looks like I am live. Alright, so welcome to tip number 6. So for those who haven't captured the last 5 or so videos, I've basically done a 10 tips on how to set yourself up for success when starting a new program or regime. But obviously these have broad application across a number of fields, so it still applies if you're on a current regime or anything that you want to apply for life. But this is particularly to do with your health and fitness or performance goals. So the trick is, tip number 6 is, if you have specific goals, then chances are you'll want to measure them. When we change our bodies and our health, it can take a lot longer than what we anticipate, right? So we tend to overestimate what we can get done in the short term and underestimate what we can get done in the long term. And a lot of the times we have to actually build in habits over a period of time to get that compounding interest impact. So if, for those who haven't heard that term before, essentially, everything we do in a day has a compounding impact. So if you are only new to your health and fitness journey and you've got 3 or 4 or 5 decades of behaviors that potentially don't serve you as well, and then you make changes over a short period of time, a matter of months, then you're still working against the grain of the compounding interest of everything that you've done in the last few decades or so. So it's going to take some time to reverse that and basically crowd out those old behaviors for more behaviors that are more congruent with what you're trying to achieve. So so basically it's also, so one, we tend to get a little bit, we tend to pressure ourselves as well when we've decided that once we've made a decision around what we actually want to achieve, right, we can't wait to get there. We're kind of focused, we're gangbusters, and we want to do everything that we can to get the results as quickly as possible. It just doesn't always happen that way, right? And because we want these changes quickly, we tend to get very impatient. I know I do. And I'm one that actually, has a vision of long-term stuff, and I still get impatient. So these, we're not immune. It's also really easy, right, to convince ourselves that we're not making any progress at all, particularly if every day feels a bit like Groundhog Day at the moment, with everything that's happening in the world. And it's even easier to think that we aren't making progress if we don't have a good way of measuring the results of our efforts. Or conversely, if you've got too many things that you're trying to measure and you just become so focused on capturing data that you don't actually, you don't actually focus on the things that truly matter, and you just create yourself more stress and activities that aren't really helping you to achieve your goals. So the trick is to find the right balance. But anyway, back to my first point is that if you're not going to have any idea around whether a program or a regime is actually working for you unless you have some sort of measure and you're measuring the right variables to keep you on track and inform you of what's happening. So, if you engage any coach, and particularly here with AKA Fitness and Nutrition, we have different ways to measure and tweak your plan based on those measurements depending on your goals. And any good coach as well should have some systems. So for myself, I've actually got an app where clients will have their programs and plans, including nutrition and fitness plans, actually allocated to them via the app. For some that doesn't work, so we still go back to other forms of documentation, but all of them will involve a level of tracking and journaling, and certain measurements or certain intervals where they need to send through things. Some of these can be, visuals, so it might be pictures that they need to send through a regular basis. It'll be check-ins, and it'll be pointed questions around some of the qualitative aspects around how they're feeling, how they're looking in clothes, and all that sort of stuff. But then, in certain aspects as well, when we're getting closer to, say, for example, if you're doing a body recomposition, then we need to have some sort of measurements around where you're at. So generally, that will involve a body composition scan because whilst we can do the caliper testing and the fat pinching test, that's not always convenient in an online environment, and it can also be quite invasive as well, right? And it's still subject to human error. What I like about body composition scans is, it tends to externalize that data. And, whilst it might not be as accurate as a DEXA scan, do we really need a Rolls Royce? Because what we need is something that, gives us an indication of where roughly we're at, and then whether or not we're heading directionally, whether the results after a period of time are directionally correct, or even if they're not directionally correct, where are we now from where we started, and what adjustments do we need to make to the plan? So some of the measurements that you might consider if you're doing your own programming regime really depends on the type of goals, right? So some of them, as I just mentioned, might be body composition. So we'd be looking at your actual body weight. We might be looking at your body fat percentage. We might be looking at your water. And we might be looking at your lean body mass as well. And also the distribution of that as well, right? So sometimes people have imbalances. And so we might need to adjust the plan, for example, to do more unilateral exercises to try and balance that. If you're doing bodybuilding, then we might do imbalance training to build up certain areas and then rotate to build up another area as we go through. So there's a level of prioritization that comes in with those aspects. And of course, we need to manipulate your calories and the potentially nutrient timing and, cycling of particular nutrients at different times depending on what type of performance we're trying to extract at the time, or body composition and so on. So there's a number of things that you'll do. The other thing that we might do, depending if you're just starting out and so on, we might actually do things as simple as body part girths, so your thigh, your waist, your upper arm, and so on. Sometimes this is actually important as well if we're actually trying to put on muscle gain. It's quite satisfying measuring biceps when they've grown and so on. So so we could do that, and same with quads. The other thing you might do is we might actually just measure your actual athletic performance. So it could be your speed, it could be your power, it could be your endurance, it could be your strength. Now, one interesting fact as well, if you think about strength, there's so many different ways around how you measure strength. So a lot of people are like, well, how much can you bench press? And then that's like one measure of how strong you are. And it's like, well, that's only one measure of how strong you are in one particular type of way of training. If you were to do, for example, if you were able to keep increasing your reps at a certain weight every week, well, then are you getting stronger? Because theoretically, the volume and the load that you're actually able to obtain would potentially make you stronger. So, and I know that there's some interrelation there, but my point is that strength is measured in different ways, and it's really important to identify what type of strength you're going for before we start measuring, what that happens to be. So as simple as tracking, the reps or the weights, or even sometimes the intensity. So, how much do we do on time under tension, or, how do we reduce the amount of rest breaks in between sets, in which case, your capacity to handle more load in a shorter period of time and increase that intensity changes. So there's a number of things, right? The other thing we might do as well, if we're looking for health markers, and this is sometimes important as well when we need to start getting deeper, we might start looking at, things like your cholesterol, your blood sugar, blood pressure, sometimes even, what micronutrients or your nutrient profile, so things like your vitamin B level, magnesium, all those sorts of things. Now, obviously, it's out of the scope of me to actually provide any direction on what those are, but there's some things that you consider. And then, for me as well, if you're going to get regular health checks with the doctor, then you should really put yourself in the driver's seat around what measures that you want to, what markers of health that you want to measure, to make sure that that your system is operating at the right levels and you're not missing anything. Sometimes doctors will push back and say, well, you don't need to have this test and so on, because they're trying to sort of save pressures on the medical system for unnecessary tests, and you might have to actually pay for some of those tests out of pocket. My argument would be, yes, but why do we always have lagging indicators? Why not use leading indicators when building your own manual? Now, what I mean by an owner's manual is, if you're going to be the expert in your own experience, then you might want to start building your own owner's manual so that you can see how things tracked over certain times in the context of where you were in your life. So if you're going through a particular stressful time and there's things happening, and you might have some markers in a journal that you can look back later, and then that informs you later around when things are changed again in the future. What were the situations or the circumstances that are potentially influencing the results that you're getting now. And it also gives you another something in the memory bank to potentially draw on as well if things start going back the other way, right? And how you might tackle it different for a different result. So, whilst, you can kind of measure as little or as much as you like, um, you do want to at least decide what those variables are and then actually track them consistently. Doing this will help you in a number of ways. So, you'll be able to see where progress is actually happening, if it is happening at all. It'll help you decide whether or not you should keep going as planned or whether or not, you need to make adjustments. And also it'll help you stay in the driver's seat, right, in respect to, where you're going and how you're getting to your goals and so on, and just knowing more about your body. Like, it helps to build that self-awareness, as I mentioned before. And staying, the captain of our own ship, right, is really, really important. So, and it's good to have that reinforcement. If you get a measurement back and it's moved in the right direction, then you'll have a moment of success or a little milestone that you can celebrate, and feel in control of things. And if the measurement comes back and it's moved in the wrong direction, well, then that's also good news. So that's the other key point as well, is that you might get these measurements, but the trick is not to put a moral judgment on them around whether or not they're bad or good, right? They're neither bad or good. It's just a matter of where you're at the moment, and it gives you an opportunity to externalize those data points, to look back at it and go, okay, what's actually happening? So it takes the emotion out of it a little bit, and you can actually look at things objectively and go, okay, what do we need to do to get to where we want to get to? So the thing is as well, right, and what it does as well, the other piece that I think is really important, if you're working towards a growth mindset or improvement, then you've got to get used to feedback, and feedback is a gift, right? So, we need to find out what's worked, what hasn't, and weed out an approach before it becomes a habit if it's not heading in the right direction, and try something else. And basically you become your own little science experiment, which is kind of exciting in itself as well. So that is tip number 6. Basically measure it, but don't over measure it. And stay tuned for the rest of the tips throughout the week. All right, cheers.